Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us on the Wealthy Her podcast series, a podcast aimed at empowering women on their journey to wealth. I'm your host, Shauna Fannin, and I'm delighted to have you join us for today's podcast, Securing Your Wealth Before Widowhood. In our introductory podcast, I read you a story about a woman whose entire life turned upside down when her husband passed away, suddenly leaving her with nothing. And time again, we come across women whose partners or significant others have passed away, and they sit for 5 years waiting for their estate to be tied up so that they can grieve and move on with their lives. So today's podcast is really dedicated to this. How do you secure your wealth before this event happens? How do you secure your wealth before widowhood? How can you make this process of probate as short as possible? And just for information purposes, probate is the name of the period that you go through when somebody has passed away and whilst the estate is being tied up. We've covered this a little bit in our Women Know Your Place webinar series, Leslie and I, and we thought it would be a good place to actually have a podcast and just kind of chat through it. And I just wanted to talk to you quickly about the notion of Women Know Your Place, because I realize it can come across as being a little bit cheeky. And yes, it is actually a bit cheeky. But really what we wanted to highlight here was, isn't it time that we really understood the effects that certain decisions are having on our life as women, or our lives as women? Today we look at one of the most important aspects of why women need to have a seat at the financial decision-making table, and the incredibly devastating effect an ill-planned estate can have on a family. What is 100% certain is that we're all going to pass away. This involves planning. As a simple will that everything you own should just be passed on to your spouse or your hubby and vice versa just isn't really sufficient. And most of us seem to have that in order. So let's just picture the scene. Suddenly your world changes and it's all very, very hard. The first few moments, weeks, months are so much more than you anticipated. And there are seemingly an insurmountable of decisions to be made, mostly to do with money. Your significant other has unexpectedly passed away, and you're left with a very real aftermath of how this estate is going to be wound up. And the nightmare begins. You find out the estate is frozen, and you cannot access any of the funds you have in the bank. Phone call after phone call, and you suddenly are having to ask friends and family for money. You can't even pay for the funeral. The house has to be sold because no one looked to see how the actual nuts and bolts of how this was going to work actually would play out. Estate duty, executive fees, bond closures, and just keeping the lights on. Wrapping up an estate is essentially tying up all the loose ends of somebody's life, their entire life. Yet we just have one little will saying, I'm going to leave everything to my hubby. 2 years later, and there's still no clarity. So we come back to that question, is having a simple will saying I'm just going to leave everything to my hubby and vice versa, is that really going to cut it? Probably not. And does it really have to be like this? Well, actually, no, it doesn't. And that's really what we're going to start discussing today. Many of our clients have really complicated estates. They have offshore and onshore investments, companies, trusts. There might be an ex-wife and children from the previous marriage. There might be parents who need to be taken care of that are actually in care homes. And there are different stages of lives for all of the individuals that are involved. So today we look at exactly this, how to wrap up an estate efficiently and effectively, taking into account the very important aspects that need to be considered. And with me today, after that very long introduction, Leslie asked me to keep it short, but I didn't listen. I've got Leslie Swart from Carrick Consult. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Shauna.
Sorry for the long introduction.
No problem.
So Leslie, there's some really horrific stats out there, and 74% of women die single. And that's just such a shocking stat. I couldn't believe it when I came across it. And I think I just wanted to start with asking you, how many of your clients that you come across where their estate planning just isn't actually sufficient?
Thanks, Shauna. It's actually more than I would like to admit to. So I think let's just pause for a second with the description of what is estate planning. You've mentioned having a will in place. That is already 100% more than a lot of our clients do have, is to know where the original will is. But that's not really estate planning. So estate planning takes a little bit more into consideration. It looks at your family structure. We spoke about marriages before on our first webinar. How are you married? What's your family structure? Do you have minor children? Do you have major children? Do you have children in South Africa only, or do you have children offshore? Do you have, like you said, do you have parents that you care for? And then looking at the family structure, then we go one step further than that to look at the assets that the person holds, assets locally, offshore, in trusts, in your own personal name. And only once you've taken all of that into consideration and you look at what would work best for your family, can you really start building a plan. And right at the end of that, there might be a will that's a 3-page document,
Right.
but the planning up to that point in time needs to be done. So if we look at estate planning in the broader sense, then there's quite a lot of our clients that do not have this in place. And quite often in my experience, the husband, because he is the sole breadwinner and he encounters through his business, he encounters a lot of financial planners or advisors that come to him to speak to him. He has a lot of planning going on, but it doesn't necessarily involve the whole family. And that's especially where women fall short, because they just get the answer to say, oh, no, don't worry, I've cared for you. It's all sorted. So I think it's a big gap in our lives to make sure that all of this has been sorted and taken care of.
Yeah. I mean, I like the way you've actually suggested all the people that are involved in one's life when you are busy trying to create wealth and manage family wealth. Because quite often I come across a number of clients who've got, loads of different advisors saying lots of different things. And I find that it's quite hard to for a client to really understand what their picture looks like, just as a holistic picture, and kind of go, okay, well, I know what this investment's doing, or I know what all of my investment's doing. And I think when you're wrapping up an estate, if you haven't actually planned for that event, and if you haven't taken all of those considerations into account, it's actually quite hard. I know when we first talked about it, it just had never occurred to me, what happens in the case with an estate where there's a new wife involved, that the first wife who's still relying on that maintenance, that you can imagine there'd probably be quite a few potential family feuds. And that's just something that one doesn't want at that point.
No, and that's where the planning comes in. In a case like that, if you had second marriages, the husband has now drafted a will that says, I leave everything to my current wife. But immediately, even if he doesn't make provision for children from a previous marriage, if there's maintenance claims, that will be a first claim against his estate. So then your wishes kind of go out the window,
Right.
because there's certain legal steps that need to be taken. So, and that's where my problem lies with just having a will and not doing the proper planning into it. Because in circumstances like that, if the planner knew about this potential claim against the estate, you could already prevent that from happening, or from that being a surprise for the rest of the family.
Right.
So, that brings me back to the planning portion of it. It's not just a simple, I have a signed will, I know where it is, and I've nominated an executor, and I'm all good. It's a little bit more than that.
Yeah. And I know we will talk about it in a bit, but I think that also speaks to communication.
Yes.
That is so vital. That actually everybody sits down and has a little chat about how this is all going to work. Because without that communication, without really voicing opinions and going, what happens in this scenario, we get a bit stuck.
That's the thing. It's uncomfortable questions to ask. None of us want to think about death, and we don't want to speak about it, even less. I always joke with my clients. I say I feel a bit like the Grim Reaper when I walk in, and I'm like, oh, and do you have a will? Has your planning been done with the aim on death? So it's a bit of an uncomfortable situation.
Yeah.
But it is very important questions to ask, and most of us avoid asking them. It's an even more difficult conversation. It's a difficult conversation having this conversation with your husband and your children, and it's even a more difficult conversation having this with your parents.
Right.
And especially with wealthy families, you need to make sure that your parents' planning falls in with what you're doing. So it's almost half a planning if you have your own planning sorted, and then suddenly you realize, oh, but I'm inheriting from my parents and they didn't do their planning, or their planning does not coincide with mine. So it is difficult questions to ask, but ever so necessary.
Yeah. And I know that within Cara Consult, you have an amazing story with regards to handing on wealth, and that's the Wealth Relay. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about that.
So we always say that if you're handing over or going on in life, it is like a relay race where the first parent will start with the race and they give it their all. But if you hand over the baton and the handover doesn't go well, you drop it, you lose the race. So it is the first person who hands over the baton needs to look forward. And the next person taking the baton must be sure that they can take it, but they also must look forward. They must never look backwards because they lose time and they're going to drop the baton. So it is the planning into the race. How are we going to hand over, practicing it, knowing that the person handing it over is going to put it into your hand, and then accepting that baton and taking it forward. We've got a bit of a motto to say that wealth really lasts 3 generations if it's not cared for and there's no proper planning. So your first generation will build the wealth. So they start from scratch. They have a motivation to build wealth. They work hard. They spend many, many hours working. And their children, the next generation, to see parents working hard, seeing how much effort it took to build the wealth. So when they now have the baton and they are in control, they preserve it. So they look after it, but they don't necessarily have the same stamina to build onto it. But then comes generation 3. They have not seen grandfather working so very hard to build this up. They just realize that there is wealth. And that's usually when the baton gets dropped. So for us, it is making sure that that process continues and that everyone is informed, and it comes down to the conversations, that they understand why this has been set up in a certain way, understand how much effort it took to build this wealth, and that they can continue with it.
It's such an amazing analogy, because I think if you think about running a race on your own, you can run it in a certain amount of time. But if there were 4 people, all fresh, starting at different sections of the race, you can run it that much faster.
Exactly.
And I love thinking about it from that aspect. You know, I can certainly build my wealth, and I'll do very well, and that'll be great. But if I mess up handing that baton on from one person to the next, or actually I apply this in my life as well, you know, moving from working to retirement, if I don't think through that process, I might as well have just kind of dropped the baton and gone on from there. So
Exactly.
I think it's an amazing analogy. For me, estate planning really articulates itself in the erosion of wealth, and you've really talked about that now, and just passing wealth on from one person to the next. Are there other aspects that you can think of that a family should consider in terms of estate planning and passing that wealth on?
I think it's a lot of it has to do with practical issues as well.
Right.
So you mentioned estates being frozen. It's a real thing. So if normally in a relationship, one partner takes responsibility of paying the water and electricity, and they pay the insurance, and Vodacom debit order goes off someone's account. So it sounds like silly things.
Yeah.
But those are the things that really become a hard process when someone passes away. You don't know where it is. You don't know who needs to be paid. You don't know who to contact. And you don't have access to funds immediately, because the person who's passed away, his accounts or her accounts will get frozen.
Right.
So it is over and above the bigger picture of how the wealth will pass on. It's also these nitty-gritty little things to make sure that life can continue. It's a difficult time to go through when someone passes away. You don't really need to struggle to get the TV license cancelled or paid.
No.
So it's really
I don't want to be
silly
thinking about
things
that.
like that. And that's where we hope to change things. So it's one, looking at the family and the family's needs, and 2, looking at the bigger picture of how the wealth will continue from the one generation to the next, and making sure that the wealth is protected. And then thirdly, dealing with life on a daily basis. How can we streamline that so everything does not come to an end?
Right. And I think you've spoken to one of the things that are really, really important to me in terms of financial planning, and that is passing wealth from one generation to the next. You know, it's not only about the estate planning and how that estate's going to be wrapped up when somebody passes away, but actually the plan to hand that wealth on. And I know we're talking about the same thing here, but it's really about talking to your parents, about understanding how that process is going to be, about looking at all the various elements that could actually take away or detract or erode that wealth. And that's not just estate taxes or somebody not knowing how to handle the business or whatever the case may be. There's quite a few angles in it. So financial planning and having a relationship with your financial planner, and having a relationship with the executor of the estate, actually talking it through is so important. Understanding the options that are available to you. Things that have come up recently with regards to discretionary trusts here in South Africa are things like, if your children are living abroad and they're beneficiaries of a trust, if that money passes down to them, they're taxed in accordance with the trust.
Correct.
And that passed, I think, end of June last year.
Yes.
Yeah. And people aren't aware of that, so there is a constant, it's not about just planning an estate and putting it to sleep and that's the end of it.
Yes.
And, hopefully somebody knows where the will is. I love that you've alluded to that a few times, actually, that nobody actually knows where the will is. So it's a constant process.
It is. I think if I can just quickly go through the process of when someone passes away, because that will give you the idea of why we struggle so often. So my colleagues and I, we have about 25 years of experience in dealing with deceased estates. And we realized that quite often family members end up on our doorstep with a suitcase, literally a suitcase full of paper that they could find in someone's house.
Which one is it?
And they're like, okay, here's everything I could find. Cheers, see you in 2 weeks.
Wow.
And it's all about knowledge. So the process really starts when someone passes away. The estate, if you know where the will is, again, the estate needs to be reported within 14 days after death, ideally.
14 days.
14
is
days.
It working days or is it just 14 days?
It just says 14 days.
Okay.
But in all essence, 14
Terms and conditions apply.
Terms and conditions apply. But in reality, these days, we don't even get a death certificate within 14 days.
Right.
But so nothing really happens until the executor has been appointed. And with a master's office at the moment, it can take anything between 2 weeks if you're extremely lucky, or 3 months. We don't know.
Why is there that difference?
It depends on which master's desk you really end up on.
Okay.
There's no specific reason. If it helps if you have everything sorted and you can report it as soon as possible.
Yeah.
But once it goes into the master's office, we obviously try our best to get it out as soon as possible. But we have no control over that. So if you need to pay bills or if you need to access funds where the executor needs to go in and close a bank account, nothing can happen until the executor has been appointed.
Right.
So you will have to wait about 3 months. So if you can imagine, if you don't know where all the assets are, or you don't know where all the documents are, you don't know where the will is, that even delays it a little bit more.
Okay.
So once the executor has been appointed, the executor can start taking control of the assets. So he can now notify the banks that you have passed away, and the executor would call for certificates of balance to say, so-and-so has passed away. We need to know how much money did he have in a bank account. So if we don't know which bank the deceased banked with, we now have to go to each of the financial institutions and ask them, did he have a bank account with you? And if he did, can you please tell us how much he has in that bank account? And some of the financial institutions have now gone to the point where they're like, well, we've got 60 days to respond to you.
Whether or not that person was a
correct
client of theirs.
Correct.
Gosh.
So it's a time delay.
Yeah.
And the executor can only really start paying for any expenses once we have access to the funds. So bank account closed, money in the estate late bank account, or life cover paid out, etc.
Amazing.
So it is a process.
Yeah.
So
it's a very long process.
We're already down like 3 or 4, 5, 6 months down the line without any closure. Mm-hmm. Then we have to advertise the estate. That has to run for 30 days. And once that's done, you can draft a liquidation and distribution account. Now, the liquidation and distribution account sets out all the assets that you had, all your liabilities. So all those certificates of balance needs to come in.
So I'm just going to stop you there for a second, because some of our listeners might not know, it's just kind of wrapping up an estate, and the thought might cross their mind going, well, but can't I just have access to those funds, I mean, why can't I just have access to those funds? What is this, the assets and the liquid and distribution? What is that all about, really?
So every single person that lives in South Africa or has assets in South Africa has to be reported. The death has to be reported to the master.
Right.
So they take control of it.
Yeah.
And obviously we need to look at the wishes of the will. And even if the will says, Shauna, you get 100% of my estate, I still have to report to the master. First of all, I need to see if there's any debts that the deceased owed.
Yeah.
Maintenance claims, that type of things. So that's why there's an advertisement to say that so-and-so has passed away. We are now administering his estate. If you have a claim against the estate, you need to come forward now.
Okay.
So that needs to go through. Then we have to report to SARS, obviously. So we need to make sure that, like I said, death and taxes. So we have to show to SARS that all the deceased's income tax, capital gains tax, all of that has been paid.
Right.
So that's part of it. So the liquidation distribution account is really a summary of a person's life.
Okay.
All the assets, all his liabilities, all the costs involved with that, paying the last municipal bill, paying the Vodacom last Vodacom bill, all of those things need to be dealt with before we can see that there is sufficient cash to give to you to pay for expenses.
And those bills, and the reason why we're wanting to approach banks and all the rest of it is we're trying to see what that bill is up until the day that person passed
Correct.
away. So
Correct.
it's done on a pro rata basis. We're going,
Yes.
okay, Shauna passed away on whatever it is, and that's how much she owes. And then thereafter is what's left over and can be
Correct.
distributed.
Correct.
Right.
And that's when we realized then if we didn't have this discussion beforehand, that's where the problems then come in. Because now suddenly you've drafted this liquidation and distribution account and you're like, hang on, yes, he's got assets, but they are either in shares in a company or it's a fixed asset and there's not enough cash.
Right.
And then then it's a whole different process because now we have to go back to the family and say, sorry, there's not enough cash to pay all the debts. We don't have enough cash to settle any taxes or capital gains tax. We will now have to sell a property.
And I like what you've said there, actually, because, well, I hate what you've said there. Let's just clarify. But I think what's important about what you said there, which people don't necessarily take into account, is shares in the company,
Yes.
is actually a debt in some respects, because that has to be paid for, either by the company or somebody has to buy it out, or, and there's a process involved there. So it's not a debt in its legal form as such, but it is quite important that when you're looking at wrapping up an estate, or you're looking at how do you pass this baton on from one family member to the next, it's also how do you pass on your shares from one company owner or director to the next.
Correct. And I think that's where if I go right back to what I said in the beginning, and that's where the planning comes in.
Yeah.
Because if we have to do this, as a matter of fact, after you've passed away,
Yes.
then if there's a problem, I can't solve it.
Right.
And then you have to make do with what you've got.
Exactly.
So yeah. So that's once a liquidation distribution account is sorted, and we now say, okay, well, all your taxes have been paid and everything, then we can wrap up the estate. So the one more advertisement to say, listen, this is Shauna's life in a 5-page summary. And if there's anyone that wants to object to it, so anyone who hasn't been paid out, or if there's another claim, they can object to it. But once that has passed, and then we can only start transferring assets. So house can be transferred, cash that's left behind, that can all be transferred. So it is a bit of a process.
That's a very, very long process.
Exactly. So add on to that, I think with spouses, if you haven't had the discussion, if you don't know where the assets are, we've had a client, it was a good story in the end, but she came to report her husband's estate. And she said, oh no, we've got a house, we've got a car, bank account, a little bit of investments, not much. We led a very simple life. And the estate was reported, and about 3-4 weeks after the estate was reported, she came to the office with a shoebox full of paper. She's like, I was clearing out my husband's desk and I found these papers in his desk. I'm not sure what to do with it. And it turned out to be share certificates.
Wow.
Worth a couple of million.
What?
Yeah, so it was a good story in the end.
That's amazing, yeah.
But can you imagine she just chucked out those papers because she didn't know what they were.
Yeah.
So for us, it's very important to have the conversations, to get the information now,
right,
as soon as possible.
As soon as possible.
Because trying to find out where you had a bank account, if you had offshore investments, where you had shares, finding those share certificates somewhere in a drawer, it's difficult to do it when I can't ask you the questions.
Right, exactly. And that really alludes to, or leads on to my next question, which was, as I spoke earlier, there's so many complicated things. There's offshore, there's onshore assets, or in investments and companies and trusts. We spoke about an ex-wife and possibly children from a previous marriage, children who might still be going through school, maybe they're in university, or maybe they require maintenance. There's parents who need to be taken into consideration who might not need to be considered right now, but certainly in the future, and may have insufficient wealth themselves, or you may be inheriting wealth. And there's different life stages for all of these people, which is really what I'm talking to. So given that it takes so very long, how do we make it much shorter? And you've already suggested, having that conversation now. So essentially killing me off today and asking me those questions, a horrible thought, but nonetheless, can you speak to how else we can shorten it?
So we have developed a program, as we call my LND.
Okay. And what does that stand for?
So my LND is my liquidation distribution account.
Okay,
So
great. And
that
that's
account,
the summary.
That's a summary.
Right.
And we're having these discussions. Like you said, we kill our clients now. We have these discussions now. So
in case you can't see Leslie, she's very, very sweet looking.
Yeah, I really don't look like the Grim Reaper.
No, it doesn't look like the Grim Reaper.
But it's having this discussion now. So I can ask you, Shona, so where did you hide those share certificates?
Where did I hide them?
So it brings me back, just a quick story. I had a client of mine who made a note for me to say that her safe's keys is in this and this book. So really this American
in
story.
A book.
In a book. Hidden in this
Really?
bookshelf. So it's
that.
lovely. But it's having this discussion now, and we literally look at it as if you were to pass away today. So if the
Right.
proverbial bus hits you today,
Okay.
what would your estate look like? And we test it. So we look at your current will, we look at your current assets, we look at your beneficiaries, your family's needs, and we draft a liquidation and distribution account.
Right.
And if it's husband and wife, we say, okay, if husband passes away first, what would his estate look like? And who will inherit? And what will they get? If wife dies first, what would her estate look like? And who would get what? And if something happens to both of you, what would the joint estate look like? And will your children be looked after?
Amazing.
And then we can ask the questions.
Right.
To say, why did you put this investment in this type of structure? What's the planning behind this? Is there sufficient cash in your estate to pay for all the costs? Do you need the house to be sold, or is the house going to continue? So these are all the difficult questions that we have to ask after death, that we now ask, and then we can actually solve them.
That's amazing, because I remember speaking to you about a client who was married in community of property, and you spoke about a webinar that we did previously on marital regimes, and why that's so important, how you married and how that's going to affect you. And just, just a reminder about why we're doing this podcast, which is giving women information, understand where you are and how this is going to affect you. Know your place. know how you're married and how that's going to affect things. And this particular client that we chatted about, he was extremely wealthy. He was the breadwinner, but he was married in community of property. And when his wife passed away, and I stand in the correction here, but I think when his wife passed away, he was going to have to pay an 8 million rand or 10 million rand or something extraordinary, simply because they were married in community of property.
That's correct. So if you're married in community of property, all the assets in the estate, it forms part of the estate. Right. So there's obviously one half undivided share that will then end up going to the surviving spouse. But the other half goes in terms with whatever the wife's will said.
Right.
So if she decided she wants to give that to the children, then half of the estate goes to the children and he's left with the other half, which is very complicated. There's fixed properties, because now suddenly you own 50% of a property, your house, and your children own the other half.
Right.
So it's very complex. Yeah.
And I think also and in terms of assets and when they're valued, I'm just thinking of another client now. It's fine saying, well, there's sufficient assets and we can just sell them off. But bear in mind that it's not always the right time to do that.
Exactly.
I think about clients who are leaving Johannesburg and they're coming down to Plet. There's this immigration going on and they can't sell their properties, and their properties are worth 20 million, but they're battling to get, I'm making these figures up, 15, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But, it's substantially less than what they were anticipating. So not really looking at that situation and not looking and working through what plan A is and what plan B is and what happens if property valuations are down at that time. Where does that leave you? It can really leave you sort of stuck.
And there's an assumption that if there's a estate sale, that the people are going to pick up a bargain. So that's also a mind thing. So you don't really want a forced sale.
No.
So if you say, listen, I want to sell the property because the spouse no longer wants to live there, different story. But if you have to sell because you need the cash to go on, you're forced to accept offers that are lower than normal. But the other side of it's also true. So we have quite a lot of clients that bought in affluent areas 20 years ago. So they bought for $1 million. And now suddenly the property is worth 14 million. Right. So with that, your estate duty has increased, your capital gains tax has increased.
Of course.
And suddenly you need more cash to transfer this property. So it's a bit of both. But again, if we have this information beforehand, we know the difficulties that we might face. So having this discussion beforehand has two two benefits for me, really. One is for the family to know exactly what's going to happen and to solve potential problems, but also for someone else to know exactly where these assets are.
Right.
Because then your whole long process of administering the estate, I won't say be cut in half, because we still have to deal with the master, the banks and SARS, but it reduces the time significantly, because we don't need to phone every single financial institution to find out if you had a bank account with them. We know immediately who to contact. So this whole suitcase full of paper becomes one file that's got everything in it. So it just simplifies the process.
And it's constantly updated as
Correct.
well.
Correct.
So, Leslie, I know there's also other practical matters that need to be considered, like does your spouse have an emergency fund, and how should your social media accounts be wrapped up? I mean, I think it's really coming down to communicating, and just and sitting down. And my understanding of the MyL&D process is sitting down with the husband and the wife and talking through exactly what's going on. Can you speak to some of the other matters that come up?
Sure. There's a lot of matters that come up, and it's quite often, once you sit down with the husband and the wife, the discussions quite often take its own process.
Right.
But I think for me it's having the difficult conversation, asking the questions, and making sure that quite often the spouse would say, "Don't worry, you cared for."
Yes.
And for me, that's almost a bit of a keeping you quiet type of thing.
Right.
That's my personal opinion.
Yeah.
But it's really making sure that everyone's on the same page and that the planning can go forward. It's like you said with the relay, it's very difficult if it's one person that has to do all 4 stages of the relay,
Yeah.
and someone standing on the side cheering on, but not really knowing what it takes to do the relay.
Right.
So we do tend to get husband and wife together and having the discussion, so that both know exactly what happens. And secondly, if there's older children, major children, we try and get them involved as well, because they are going to be the next generation and they need to be part of this discussion as well. They don't need to know all the intricacies, but they need to know why there's certain structures in place. And then we also tend to start with the next generation's planning, so that the two interlink with each other.
Okay.
So for me, it is having the conversation, knowing the facts, asking the questions, and updating it. Like you said, it's not something that you do today and then again in 10 years' time.
No.
It is something, life changes. You have children moving overseas, you have children growing up, you have elderly parents that you have to care for. You might decide yourself to move to Portugal. So there's a lot of things that happen on a daily basis. So it's not a once-off exercise. It's something that you have to build on continuously.
And I think also to that is that increasing price of property.
Yes.
That's also so assets change in value.
Correct.
And needs to be reconsidered.
And as their values change, as your tax liabilities change.
Exactly, yeah. And you actually spoken to a question that I had here, which I think is really important. I'm just going to verbalize it in a slightly different way, and that is, I come across so many clients, and female clients with Carrick-Athena, whose husbands have said to them, "Don't worry, it's fine. Everything's taken care of." And actually, they don't understand the process of how it works. But it's also very hard to ask that question from the spouse because of the roles that these two individuals have held during their married life. And there's no right or wrong about it. It's just how it's unfolded, essentially. So that question becomes quite a difficult question to ask when it hasn't been your process to handle the finances. And I think the reason that happens is that people suddenly feel second-guessed or questioned. And what you've been talking about with communication is so important. So, how would you suggest that women potentially ask that question?
It is very difficult.
Yeah.
So I think if you find it difficult to speak to your husband and you're not sure what questions to ask, so it's like, how do you start a conversation? Get a professional in to sit with you.
Yeah.
Maybe on your own first, sit down and say, these are my concerns, or what should I be concerned about, or what could go wrong? This is how I'm married. This is what I know, and what else do I need to know?
Yeah.
And then get the conversation. So it's almost first asking, what should I know and what don't I know, and then asking the questions. But get a professional in to assist you and that take that first steps in having the conversation.
I think quite what I've actually found with quite a few clients as well in terms of introducing this, bearing in mind that it's death that we're talking about, it's really, really hard. And that wealth relay is such a great way to introduce it. So if there's a, if it is something that one is battling to communicate with one's partner, suggest it as a story.
Yes.
Here's this wealth relay and this is what happens, and I've got to know how to pass the baton on, because otherwise I'm going to drop it.
Yes.
And I'd hate for that to happen. So can you tell me how to do that?
Exactly.
It's fun. It's not, there's no attack involved there. It's
Correct.
kind of quite open-ended. It's
Correct.
really such a great analogy. I wanted to ask you about people who've assigned family members as executors. So quite often people don't want to pay executor fees because we're trying to just sort of manage and keep expenses down. But what happens if I sort of appoint a brother, or just somebody who's living overseas, who's really astute with finances? But how does that work out?
So I think that's going to be an argument for a whole different podcast.
Okay.
But in short, so you as an individual is free to nominate whoever you want to as your executor of your estate.
Right.
The problem lies with the master's office. So the master is not going to appoint someone as executor who does not know this whole process of contacting the banks and the drafting a liquidation distribution account and contacting SARS, etc. So if you nominate your brother, for example, as your executor, and he's not an attorney, he's not well known to the process, then the master is going to insist that he appoints an agent to assist him. So the agent needs to be a trust company,
Right.
or attorney, or an accountant. So there's always going to be an executor's fee. So some people say, okay, well, I'm going to appoint a family member, because then the family member can go out and negotiate this fee with whoever, which is also true. But they're also already going through a difficult process. They've just lost someone.
Yeah.
So now you're sending them out into the wide world to go and find a suitable executor. To shop. Exactly. So for me, it is, why do you want to leave that to someone else?
Yeah.
Death and taxes, executor's fees, part of that conversation. There's going to be a fee.
Right.
So rather shop around yourself, find someone that you are comfortable with, that your family's comfortable with, and who knows where your assets are, and build a relationship with them and negotiate this fee up front.
Yes.
So you take control of your own estate.
Yeah.
So for me, it is and first, just to interrupt myself there, another thing is, if you appoint your brother or sister or another family member, they can also pass away. So,
Of course.
and
yeah.
that leaves your estate with no executor, another delay in the process. So for me, it is, find someone that you feel comfortable with, find a company that's going to still be there the day that you pass away, and then negotiate with them and take control of your own estate. So that's really, for me, in short. Offshore executors, not a good idea. So firstly, your executors, there's a lot of original documents that they still have to send to the master's office. So if you have an executor that's sitting in Australia, wherever, there's going to be a delay.
Yeah. I mean, I think one just has to remember to picture the process. So your loved one has passed away. You are needing to wrap up this estate. You're grieving. It's really, really hard. You're
Yes.
trying to pay bills. And now you've got to go out and shop for somebody to try and wrap up the estate.
Exactly.
And it's not just paying fees. I mean, there are fees to be paid. There's advertising that has to be done.
Correct.
All of those things. And if you've left it to somebody who's living abroad, they've now got to come back and they've got to file with the master in the area that person
Correct.
lived in. So you can't, if you passed away in Cape Town, but actually you live in Plet, you've got to go to Plet.
Yeah, luckily Plet falls under Cape Town, so
Okay,
that's
great.
fine.
Bad example, sorry.
But yeah, it's true. So just to give you an idea, during lockdown, we had to report an estate, and one of there was no nominated executor. The person passed away without a will, and we had to get the consent of one of the children that was living in Australia to appoint an executor. It cost about 3,000 Rand to get one piece of paper back into South Africa.
No,
to South
that's really
Africa.
intense. So Leslie, it's really essential. I know I keep harping on about this, but really essential to have a seat at the financial decision-making table with the family, not only in terms of having your own money and knowing how you can control it, but also understanding how the family's money is going to be divided up, how it's going to work, if there's anything that needs to be taken care of. And really all that you've told me there is communication is so key,
Yes.
but also planning and thinking through all the various elements that could occur. And I think, I mean, you've enlightened me to so many aspects. I would never have considered social media accounts, or, what happens to aging parents, or, all those various factors that need to be taken into account. And I think that's why, again, having that relationship with your advisor is so important, and just making sure that they're highlighting areas that have come up that you might not be aware of. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add.
I think it's just as a summary is ask difficult questions, know what you don't know, and then plan accordingly.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you here.
Cool.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.